There are two ways to ascend towards information material. One is such that the environment, and by that we mean the objects of perception, what surrounds one's daily senses, whether by sight, hearing, vibration, sentimentality, all those things allow for the appropriation of material that eventually seizes into the psyche in a way that allows for the internal process to regulate itself however it sees fit, and the process of thinking occurs. If one were, for instance, in a desolate arena that has no appropriation of human tradition, because even a single item, let's say a pen, if somebody was in a forest, lost to civilization and its memory, and they have a pen, from that pen they can appropriate the details that bridge back, because it is a perceptual item. It is available in the environment, and it leads back to a whole set of data points that reference other data points in regards to their memory. Obviously, in the case of one who doesn't have the memory of civilization behind them, then such a pen has little function, but it does have a certain function. This is why even the smallest amount of contact to an indigenous population would have a drastic effect on the process of their thinking, because even though we don't realize it, in the object itself one finds the details that lead back to civilization within itself, rather than just as a memory, because it's a perceptual item, meaning there's functionality to it, there's properties to it. It automatically displays itself as something manufactured or produced, rather than something incumbent upon nature. It is something that differentiates itself from nature as sort of human abridgment. It even exemplifies the human structure based on the fact that it displays the sort of differentiation that the human being made in accordance, because it is strictly something away from the general function of nature. Like a tree doesn't produce such an effect, although for the incumbent mind such will have an effect, because they recognize that even within nature there's a process to all things that are specialized in their own way and don't deserve to be coupled in sort of this worldly experience of the external world, but rather true to itself. I mean, there's something consequential in the regular functionality of a tree that doesn't define itself by broader or stricter parameters. But because there was never the sequence for the indigenous mind of producing an effect of differentiation, this pen that comes before them is immediately in that production. They're forced to then secrete themselves from regular process of worldly attribution or the normal function of their experience, and rather say that there is a differentiation problem. There is a brain that separates itself from the world in some way. And so in it of itself, the perceptual item does imbue that detail, besides its trace of memory, but for sure for the case of the individual that does produce that effect because of memory, because they've had the data references, right? A pen, it speaks to the enormous volumes of data that was imprinted based on the pen, and so on and so forth, and that all leads back based on memory. But as we are saying, it is also based on the object. But besides all of this, there is the other appropriation of the functionality of a psyche that doesn't rely on the object formation of perception, meaning the pen, for example, whether in its reference or in its ambiguous state and differentiation of regular nature, as we call it. And that is the ideation that functions on itself. Now, ideation is not a material object. We can't build an idea in sort of the real way, because it is another process of the psyche. It's another construction of the psyche. We can't literally construct it because it doesn't have that, and an attempt to do so, which it strictly is something that is attempted to do, whether by arts or by to process the idea as sort of something that is articulated in material form. Still, it doesn't have the appropriation of materiality. But besides that, there is such a thing as ideation, and the ability for the psyche to live upon ideation and gain its vitality through such an effect. And the reason this could happen is because ideation can be sort of looked at as the frontal perceptual data of the psyche, almost like the object that serves the psyche as a perceptual data point, right? The pen serves towards the psyche as something of conference. Within the psyche itself, there is also the process of being able to structure the vitality of the psyche around an idea, and it stands before the psyche as though the idea is external to the psyche but not external to the world, somewhere in the middle ground, because the idea is in itself without direction or understanding. And this is why certain tradition requires that the idea not be questioned, because the idea is meant to serve as this middle ground. It needs a certain formation of materiality, that it just is, as it were. And through the ideation, one can process the rest of the psyche based and in part on that ideation, but that one needs to bridge into the ideation at times in order to gain its vitality, because the ideation is definitely the bridge between the two worlds. So we understand a little bit why the ideation gives back to the internal world, because it serves as the sort of perceptual bridge between worlds. But ideation also has the ability to connect to perceptual data points. This is why specific ideas are always requisite and other ideas are not requisite, because only those ideas that refer back to a social form of consciousness based on perceptual data, based on the external world, that is the ideations that serve that process. This is why one of the grand ideations of, let's say, modern or the grandstanding of hominins or whatever, is the domestication process, or specifically the familial body, because it is an idea fundamentally rather than a perceptual data, right? It's an idea of family, right? There's no materiality to that. It could be called the home, but that is just a reference point to the idea rather than the idea referencing back to the home. The home is not a material function. It's rather to serve the idea, and we know this because the second there is question to relationship or to familial bodies, the home becomes instantly abandoned and useless, and the function of its perceptual form has no ability to transform. Rather, it is completely reliant and dependent on the idea. And so we have this ideation, but it does lead back automatically to perceptual forms because it is the consequence of domestication of something grander, so that whatever perceptual forms meet that idea, thus the family body evolves with the public evolution. It's consequential of each other. It's mutually bound, and that very ideation continues onwards to build as the bridge between parts. Therefore, one can function theoretically in the familial space and whether by psyche or by external family bonds, as long as both the ideation reaches back to the public sphere in some possible intersection, and that it functions as a familial internality as it sees according to those rules. But most importantly, based on its ideation rather than its perceptual form. Therefore, one gains no steps in the process of development in the domestic space through anything other than the idea of that domestic space, rather than its space itself. And the opposite is true in the case outside of that, where the only method of development is through the perceptual data or the objects external to the individual, because that is the only habitat of consequence and that which allows the psyche to function in its proper formation, period. Now, saying all that, it is going to be that there is an ability in the residence of ideation that one can function as with more detail to all the processes that one seeks to search for, right? Because once one is not reliant on perceptual form, meaning the perceptual world has little consequence, but rather ideation is of utmost consequence. Now one can reach into any perceptual form based on the ideation and gain its detail. Now the question would be, if that is simply the mode apparatus, then one can retract back to the regular perceptual forms outside of the ideation, and then they found their function. But because perceptual forms are a consequence of each other and are dynamically linked, they have little ability to be differentiated and understood in consequence of each of its own. There is no ability to trace a specific aspect, although one can differentiate through intellectuality, but it is that intellectuality is based on perceptual forms that allowed for the differentiation. Therefore, one is being regulated and controlled by perceptual forms to differentiate perceptual forms. So then the question is that really differentiation? But then in the case of ideation, if someone's residing away from those perceptual forms, when they do retract into those perceptual forms, they do gain access to its full database, or very much so its database, because one is not reliant on perceptual forms for the vitality of their psyche. And thus, now they gain access to these perceptual forms, although the perceptual forms are only based on the ideation, such that if one doesn't develop the ideation, then the vitality within the perceptual forms lack substance, so that it's reliant on each other. And more so, in the development of the ideation, one needs to lead to its consequential end in order to gain access to the perceptual forms, because the depth is only allowed as long as there is depth to the ideation, because that is the source of vitality. So that if one chooses to look at the pen in a domestic space, they require the ideation of the domestic space to reach back into the perceptual form of the pen and then lead to its details that are only consequential at that level, because they've suspended the reliance on perceptual form. So that's just the duo and the difference between the two sides. Thank you for participating and listening.